It's happened again. Another American city erupts in violence as the frustration of a black man dying in a police-involved shooting spills onto the streets. And spill it did in Charlotte as police fired shots to clear intersections, used tear gas to disperse crowds. One man is in critical condition after being shot by another civilian. All this came as protesters clashed with police and vandalized businesses. The catalyst for this mayhem was the shooting of Keith Lamont Scott. Officers were executing a warrant on another man when he emerged from a nearby car. Family members say he was carrying a book. But police maintain Officer Brentley Vincent faced an armed man and that Scott ignored verbal warnings to drop his gun before Vincent shot him. Authorities say no book was found near Scott, but that a gun was. Protesters believe police overreacted and point to what happened a few days earlier in New Jersey.
A terrorist, New Jersey, New York, he was taken alive. They said they wanted to question him. So because of you wanting to question him, does his life mean more than our black men across the nation?
The value of a black man's life is a question that has been raised over and over again as the number of police-related shootings continue to climb. One also happened in Tulsa over the weekend. A man with his hands up was shot by an officer along a busy road. Here in Massachusetts, the state's highest court weighed in on the way men of color are treated by law enforcement. It threw out a man's gun conviction based on the premise he may have been warranted to flee from police because of a pattern of what they called racial profiling. This is the 20-page ruling handed down unanimously on Tuesday. It was based in part on a report by the ACLU, which found between 2007 and 10, about 2/3 of Boston police encounters were with people of color, although they make up only about a quarter of the population. The ruling then stated, quote, "The finding that black males in Boston are disproportionately and repeatedly targeted for FIO, field interrogation and observation encounters suggests a reason for flight totally unrelated to consciousness of guilt. Such an individual, when approached by the police, might just as easily be motivated by the desire to avoid the recurring indignity of being racially profiled as by the desire to hide criminal activity." Boston Police Commissioner Bill Evans wasn't happy with the ruling.
Relying on a report that is clearly biased by the ACLU, it really bothers me. And our officers do a great job out there every day taking the guns off the street, and they're going to continue to do that.
This is a difficult time for all parties involved, trying to balance public safety with personal safety. Joining me are Carl Williams. Carl's an attorney with the ACLU. Carl, it's good to see you again. Natasha Tidwell, an attorney and former police officer, is now working with the Justice Department on consent decrees with the Ferguson and Newark Police Departments. Good to see you, too. And Jeff Zarnock is an associate dean of criminal justice at Southern New Hampshire University, former Manchester police officer. Jeff, it's good to see you. Same. The recurring indignity of being racially profiled, even in what is acknowledged, I think, by most, and my bet is by you, as one of the better police departments in America. How big a deal is this ruling?
I think it says something that people in communities of color, particularly in black communities in Boston, have been thinking, saying, and feeling for a long time. And a lot of folks that I know were very pleased with the ruling and were a little bit shocked that it came out of the Supreme Judicial Court. And
that it was unanimous.
And that it was unanimous. And we're pleased with the writings from Justice Hines in that.
You do some work with the Boston Police Department. By the way, this review the ACLU did was in earlier years. Doesn't reflect what the current administration is doing or not doing. Is there an impact beyond our borders? Does this send a message somewhere? I mean, it is a pretty powerful statement by a court.
I think it will have far-reaching implications. Most notably, I think, one of the striking things from the report by Professor Braga and the others who did the initial report and the ACLU report is that from 2007 to 2010, when they looked at the data and this notion of to investigate person as the basis for these stops, no one was auditing that to go back and say, well, what do you mean by that? So the fact that it went on this long without anyone asking the officers to articulate more in the reasonable suspicion or probable cause for these stops is my hope would be that other police departments will look at that and say, well, wait a second, there could be a basis for these stops, but until we start to articulate it, we're going to find ourselves, behind the eight ball when it comes to
Will other
these
police
things.
departments, like the one you used to work in, will they do what Natasha's suggesting? Will they take a look at this and say, this might be us?
This is a head-scratching moment for a lot of administrators. This is going to impact training, and policy, and deployment, and context, and verbiage, and report writing. It's going to impact a wide range of areas for every police department that's dealing with any particular community. Hoping that their talent is not thrust against the wall of just a kind of a blind motive on just baseline numbers alone.
I want to step back from a little bit. It's fair to say that we're experiencing an epidemic. I'm stating the obvious. I mean, young black men, for the most part, being shot by cops. You're working, as I said, on some of the monitoring teams in Newark and Ferguson. Now it's Tulsa and Charlotte. Is prevention even part of the discussion, or is it just people like you going in after the fact to try to reform after a horrible situation? Is that you know what I mean?
The after action.
Yeah, exactly. As
Well,
opposed to stopping the action before the fact.
Well, there have been some police administrators across the country who've been very proactive in getting out ahead of this and asking either monitors or other people to come in and look at their practices before it gets to the point of a consent decree. So Charles Ramsey has done that both in Washington, D.C. and in Philadelphia. So the hope is that other people, you don't want to be the person who has justice coming in and telling you what to do. You want to look around and sort of the handwriting's on the wall, and they need to start to do this themselves.
It was a white cop in Tulsa, and as you saw that photo, of people to know, it was a black cop in Charlotte. So is this about racism, or is it about policing abuses? What are we talking about?
I was just actually going to go to the word epidemic.
Yeah.
Really, what we're seeing now across the country is just seeing something, because people outside of communities of color that are suffering a lot of these indignities and killings know that it's been happening since. It's like, it wasn't better for folks in the 60s. It certainly wasn't better in the 30s. So this isn't something new. The new part is folks got cameras, right? Folks are talking about it. And also the other piece that's new is there have always been movements for civil rights for people of color and black people in this country, but there's a new one. And people are talking about it, so there's a forum to talk about it.
But how about this issue? In most of the conversations I've heard, people are focusing on the fact that there's this deep systemic racism in police departments. But when a black cop does the shooting, like happened in Charlotte, what do you say then?
I think that's saying, can a black cop do something that is exhibits racial bias, even against
another black
people?
person? Yeah,
certainly that's the case, right? And historically, that has always been the case. And I think that's the thing that we need to address. It's why are people using this level of escalating things to this level of violence, and what communities are we policing, and why are we policing them, and how?
Why are they escalating them to this level of violence? I mean, we all know, what Carl said is true. I'm sure this is not a new phenomenon, but just like we didn't know that there were Rodney Kings before Rodney King, we all woke up after Rodney King and realized that he was not a new phenomenon. So now we get it, I think.
Well, you look back at Rodney King, it was part and parcel to an overall macro issue that was going on with LAPD, which they were able to document in terms of bias, subjectivity, and racism. That's one thing. I would prefer to separate the shooting that occurred down in Carolina with the civil unrest that's part of it, because the civil unrest may have been, this was triggered, I'm going to say, by a lot of the conditions that have been prevalent in the communities, minority communities, for a long time, i.e. poor infrastructure, poor schooling, a lot of socioeconomic frustration.
And just brought to a head by a shooting.
And that's all, sometimes that's all it takes.
Wesley Morris used to be at the Globe, is now the Washington Post, just tweeted something out, I guess it was a story of his in the Washington Post, that while there are more police shootings, getting back to the camera thing, that are recorded on body cams, more often than not, they're not released. Why is that? We saw this absurd position by the mayor of Charlotte. While Tulsa, it's out in a minute. And when Osama Rahim is shot here, it's out to family and community in a minute. In the Boston department, the mayor of Charlotte, she hadn't even seen the video this morning, much less the family and the community. What's this with the body cams? Why are we not seeing what they're doing?
Well, I think one of the issues in Charlotte is the body camera policy they have says, well, it's only released to the people who are on the video and to the officers in preparation of reports and things like that. So they've got this policy that they're able to sort of point to and say, well, we can't release it because these are the conditions.
Yeah, but when the mayor doesn't even look at it, you say to yourself, I want plausible deniability,
right.
So as long as I don't see it, I can't be caught in a statement I make about it.
And that's, you look no further than Chicago to see how, the presence of a video or the release of it, can be sort of played with along the lines. I just want to get back to something that Carlton mentioned about bias and its relation with, you've got a black police officer or a white police officer. I think the idea of who we see or who is perceived reasonably as a threat is really what's driving a lot of this. And as long as the courts have, when looking at these shootings, have said, well, as long as the officer was in reasonable fear for his or her safety or the life of others, if the perception of a black man is, if it's reasonable to fear him, then deadly force is reasonably applied. And so if you have someone like Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old boy in Cleveland, well, the 12-year-old black kid looks 18. So it becomes, so all of these implicit bias issues, they affect everyone across the spectrum. It's not just, white officers as black officers. And that's, driving, I think, some of this.
I want to ask one last thing quickly. If we can. We all heard that while Donald Trump yesterday showed unusual empathy for what happened in Tulsa, same day he talked about stop and frisk. Today he said, well, I only meant in Chicago. I didn't mean across the country. Hillary Clinton talks about, I've met with mothers, I understand this stuff. Very quickly going down the line, does either candidate get it? Do they, forget the rhetoric. Do they get what's going on, and do they have, I wouldn't say a cure, but do they get what's necessary to be done to deal with this?
I'm not going to make an endorsement, but
you don't have to.
I don't think you're asking me, but some of the things that have been said are, I would say, less than encouraging.
On both sides?
I think on both sides. I think people really need to get to the core of the way policing is done, and exactly what Natasha said. In our neighborhoods are feared, right? I could name a list of neighborhoods in Boston, and people will go, "Oh, that's a bad neighborhood," right? And when police come into those neighborhoods and they see people who, might look like us, they say, "Oh, that," and those are factors actually that go into the law. People say this was a high crime neighborhood, right? I could say, "Hey, is Beacon Hill a high crime neighborhood?" It's a fair argument. But those are things that we live with in our communities all across this country, whether it's in Tulsa, it's in Boston, or it's in, Baton Rouge.
Quickly, if we can, does anybody get it that's running, or are they just...
I'm inclined to agree with Carlton here that there is work to be done on both sides of the aisle, more so some more than others.
Look in your face.
Right.
Talk about Okay, how about you, Jim?
Diplomacy.
I don't think they understand the entire systemic issues that are really at stake here. There's a lot more than just the final reaction and the cell phone video of a bad or a good or a righteous shooting, per se. There's a lot more factors that they need to be addressing first.
Shouldn't they address, it seems to me, transparency, a mandate, a directive from above, that transparency is the rule, to me at least, is a great first step. Carl, we got to go. It's great to see you. Thank you so much, Natasha, and you as well. Jeff, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.